Well, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Library, and if you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina. On Sundays, I do a thing called Books and Booze, where I review a book and mix up a cocktail. This month, we are looking at Murder, making this week's book All That Is Wicked, a Gilded Age story of murder and the race to decode the criminal mind by Kate Winkler Dawson. You might notice my background is not my usual books. I am in my office, but my desktop computer died, so I'm recording from my laptop. So the recording is... We're going to see. We're trying to do this and not have it be hit and miss, but we'll find out. The accompanying cocktail is a Satan's Whiskers, which came from a list of Gilded Age cocktails and fits because look at this man. I mean, just look at the whiskers, right? This is Edward Ruloff. He is the subject of this week's book. So a Satan's Whiskers is a half ounce each of gin, dry vermouth, sweet vermouth, and orange juice, 2 teaspoons of Grand Marnier liqueur, and 1 teaspoon of orange bitters. So let's do this. Everything's backwards for me now. My cocktail's all on the right instead of my left. Everything is just very, very backwards. John Edward Howard Ruloffson was born on July 9th, 1819 in St. John, Canada. I forget which province that is. You could Google it easily enough. His father died when Edward was 5, leaving his mother to raise him and two brothers, so 3 sons, all by herself. I forgot how good Old Heyman smells. Yeah, that is a really solid gin. His father had been a farmer, and a poor farmer. Like they were not wealthy by any metric, but his mother was educated and wanted her sons to be educated. She instilled in him a love of education and a desire to be a proper gentleman, which was a pretty lofty goal for somebody who was born to a poor farmer, in the 19th century. But his mother, Priscilla, meant to see her kids educated, and she was able to get Edward into an academy, I think it was the St. John Academy, where he discovered a love of languages and to a lesser degree philosophy. He eventually came to disdain religion, even though his own mother was very religious and raised him to be religious. That eventually he fell out of love with religion not too long after he discovered philosophy, which, okay, he would not be the first person to fall out of love with religion with the advent of philosophy. It was during his time at St. John Academy, I'm just going to call it that, I think that's right, that he started learning Greek, which would become the foundation of his own philological theory. We're going to come back to that in a bit. Philology is literally the study of languages. His theory was, well, like I said, we'll come back to that. Ruloffson decided while in school that he wanted to spend his life as an academic, which... Hey, I get it. I love to read, clearly. That's what I'm doing here, right? I understand wanting to spend all of your time reading all of the books. Ruloffson wanted to spend his life as an academic. He approached his uncle, who was the only person he knew who might be able to help bankroll this dream of his, and was roundly rejected. His uncle's like, no, I'm not going to pay for you to spend all of your time in school. Get a job, pay for it yourself, which, okay, fair. A teaspoon of orange bitters is a lot of freaking bitters, just FYI. Usually it's only a dash or 2, but a full teaspoon is a lot. Like 6 or 7 dashes. Let me shake this up. His uncle rejects him. He's not going to support Ruloffson's dream of doing nothing for the rest of his life but reading books and, languages. I kind of understand the uncle's point of view. You want to do that, fine, but do it on your dime, not mine. So Ruloffson went and got his first job. First, he was a law clerk, which would serve him in very good stead later in life. But then he got a job as a store clerk. And it was as a store clerk that he would experience his first arrest. So he would start with small burglaries and I think an arson. And the arson may have actually come first, like the building burned down. And nobody suspected the good, clean cut, even with the whiskers, that was a normal hairstyle back then. He was a clean cut, educated, well-spoken young man. So nobody suspected him of being the arsonist. But then when the store reopened at a new location, small thefts started happening. And then there was another small fire. Well, the final... nail in the coffin of his life as a store clerk, if you will, was he stole a bolt of fabric and then came into work wearing a suit made out of that fabric. He was believed to be innocent until that, right? I mean, he didn't look like a criminal. And back then they believed that if you didn't look like a criminal, you weren't a criminal, basically, which the store owner called him out on it. He's like, I recognize that fabric. Just admit you stole it and I won't press charges. And Ruloffson, he was still Ruloffson at this time, declined to admit that he stole it and actually got kind of snotty. He's like, I will not, sir, or something like that, and was immediately placed under arrest, tried, convicted of theft, served his first jail and sentence in Canada, 2 years for theft. I was a little concerned because it mixes up a lot like a martini at first, and I did not like the martini, if I recall, but the orange really, really pulls it together. That's not too shabby. When he was released from prison in Canada, he needed to find a way to make his own way in life because now he had nothing left for him. He wasn't going to get another job in St. John Province or St. John Township or whatever because small town, everybody knew he'd been sentenced and served time as a thief, so he had to leave Canada. Well, he didn't have to leave Canada, he had to leave that area. He opted to leave Canada, went to New York. So he went to upper New York, upper state, right? Basically just across the Canadian border. And he initially hired on as like a canal worker or boat crew with a packet boat owned by Henry Schutt. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I think it's Schutt, though. The Schutt family was well known. They were close-knit. They were a wealthy clan of farmers in upper state New York and, boaters or whatever. And Ruloffson, who on his relocation after prison renamed himself Edward Ruloff, and I will call him Ruloff at this point, he at first made a very good impression, right? Again, he was obviously educated. He was well-spoken. He was looking to move up in the world. He expressed a desire to be a teacher. And he spoke Greek, he spoke Latin, he spoke German, he was learning other languages. And so he was embraced by the family at first and became a teacher in Dryden, New York, where the family was centered, rapidly forming a bond and a relationship with Harriet Schutt, who was the much beloved daughter of the clan. I think she was 16 when they first met. Maybe she was 17, but she wasn't much older than that. And I actually very much appreciated, the author pointed out, because I know a lot of people, obviously with, the whole Epstein thing going on, righteously in a rage over people who take advantage of young girls. Totally get it. But at this point in the 19th century, this was not unusual. There was nothing creepy or wrong about this. The family was at first flattered that Edward was so attentive to their daughter. All right. He was 22, 23 years old, so between 5 and 6 years older than him, which was a not unreasonable age gap at that time. All right. This was not uncommon. I mean, that Laura Ingalls Wilder, I know in the books and in the TV show, she presents her husband as only being about 5 years older than her. In reality, he was about 10 years older than her. So this was natural progression. The age difference was right. Everybody was happy at first. The problems began well before the couple actually married. Harriet's brothers, especially her oldest brother, Ephraim, noticed that Ruloff was a bit possessive and argumentative and jealous, not just of Harriet, but of the success of her family. And he very much felt himself to be an outsider. No matter what the clan did to welcome him in, he saw himself as the outsider looking in. The family queried Harriet, "Are you sure this is the guy?" And because 17-year-olds the world over are known for making solid decisions, she swore he was the love of her life, and the couple married on at the end of December 1843. I don't think she actually said in the book what the date was, but one of the websites that I was looking at on Ruloff said it was like December 31st, like the last year of December 1843, right? Or last day in December of 1843. So almost immediately, Ruloff found problems with his young wife. And I mean, their wedding day, he found problems with his young wife. Namely that her cousin, a medical doctor, she calls him Bull in the book, and I can't remember what his last name. I don't think it was Schutt, because that would stick out as really funny to me. It's just way too close to, Cousin came up and gave her a kiss, and Edward thought that was inappropriate. The same cousin would also kiss Amelia Schutt, who married Harry's brother William the very next day. And because guess what? I mean, close families kissed each other to congratulate each other on milestones achieved, like marriage. But Ruloff got pissy and jealous, picked a fight with Harriet, and the couple fought all the time. Not just after the wedding. They were fighting before the wedding, which is, like I said, that's why her family's like, "Are you sure this is the guy?" And like I said, 17-year-olds. They're very convinced that they are always right and know everything. A few months after they married, Harriet and Edward moved to Lansing, New York, which is about 10 miles away from the Schutt family heartland of Dryden, New York. 10 miles doesn't sound like a lot, but in the 19th century it was. They didn't have cars. Mid-19th century, they had horses, buggies. You could walk the 10 miles, but it was a day trip if you're going to go visit them, right? Continued fighting. The family was very much aware of this because of various family members visiting. Harriet would visit them. Edward might come with them, but it was well known that the couple were not happily married. Oh shit, maybe his last name was Schutt. I have this in my right up here. Part of Ruloff's problem with Bull Schutt. Hold on. That can't be real. That can't be real. Hold on. I have to have typoed that. Oh, he's Dr. Bull. What the fuck was his first name? Henry. Henry Bull. Hold on. So part of Ruloff's problem with Dr. Henry Bull, the doctor cousin who kissed Harriet, is that he was a doctor. And so much respected. All right. Doctors back then, this is probably would have more aptly been called a surgeon. All right. And my reasoning for that is because Ruloff was also supporting himself not just as a teacher, but as an apothecary, which would also be seen as part of the medical field back then. But I kind of wonder if Ruloff had approached his uncle and said, hey, I'd like to be a doctor. Would his uncle have supported that? Like if he had said, I want to be a surgeon, I wonder if his uncle would have supported that. I mean, it's irrelevant, but it's just an idle thought. But still, like I said, Ruloff, to help offset his teacher's income, which wasn't much, was also learning to be an apothecary. And basically somebody who would treat illnesses through medicine, herbal remedies, right? Apothecaries were not looked down on in the 19th century. Right? This was a respected position in the 19th century. It was not a well-paying position in the 19th century. So when William Schute's wife Amelia became ill with childbed fever shortly after delivering their first baby, he begged Ruloff for a remedy to save his young wife and infant daughter. All right, and the author kind of glosses over why that Bull wasn't asked. But if he was a surgeon versus an apothecary, that would explain why they would go to Edward. Now, from the safe remove of 180 years later and a whole lot of research in science, it is widely believed that Amelia and baby Emily were Ruloff's first victims. And it's entirely possible they were. All right, we just don't know. I mean, he certainly made creepy statements to the Shute family matriarch, Hannah Shute, that indicates he could have deliberately poisoned his sister-in-law and baby niece. Honesty compels me to say that there is no evidence of that. And it is equally likely that both died of childbed fever, which was incredibly common in the mid-19th century. And that Ruloff simply reveled in the family's dismay because by this point in time, he loathed his in-laws. So he could have sped them along their earthly path. We don't know. All right, there's just no way of knowing at this point. They did at one point exhume the bodies trying to look for poison, but they never found it. So, who knows? There's a lot of poisons they didn't have tests for. Like arsenic was common back then. Arsenic didn't show up, and they had a test for arsenic by this point in time. We don't know. There's just no way of knowing. So people like to say that, yes, he absolutely killed his niece and daughter. The author certainly says repeatedly that he killed at least 5 people. We can only absolutely definitively say he killed 2. More on that in a little bit. Okay, more on that right now, and then more on that in a little bit. There is no question that 2 months after Amelia and Emily died, he killed his wife, 19-year-old Harriet, possibly their infant daughter. Almost certainly their infant daughter, but we have to say possibly because, there's not really any evidence of that. We know he killed Harriet because he actually admitted it in 1871 to his biographer, who was Edward Hamilton Freeman, a.k.a. Ham. The confession came out while Ruloff was sitting in prison awaiting execution for another crime, so the admittance of this past murder was not going to make a difference one way or the other to his fate. Ruloff never admitted ever to having killed his 2-month-old daughter Priscilla. He only ever claimed to have given her a sleeping draught because she wouldn't stop crying. This one's a bit harder to say maybe he didn't. I mean, with Amelia and Emily, alternate cause of death is highly plausible, childbed fever. It's not like 2-month-old Priscilla would have wandered her way to a nearby neighbor to be raised as a foundling, all right? And in rural upstate New York, any neighbors would have been like, this must be the Ruloff baby. There are no other babies born in the area right now, so realistically, that's unlikely. At one point, Ruloff did claim that he took the infant to one of his brothers to raise. However, as Winkler Dawson points out, that's unlikely. It would have been a 700-mile round trip to the brother's location and then back. It would have been impossible in a time before modern transport, all right? The horses and buggies would have taken forever. It's unlikely. So most likely the infant was killed at the same time as Harriet. We do know definitively from Ruloff's later trial for the murder of Harriet is that around the time that she went missing, he borrowed a horse and cart from a neighbor who helped him to load a trunk into the cart, and Harriet was never seen again. What he admitted to Ham was having dumped Harriet's body into Cayuga Lake, and he tried to make it sound like it was an accident, like he accidentally hit her over the head with a 20-pound pestle from his apothecary kit. That was an accident. Hard to believe that's an accident. That's what he claimed. So yeah, he said he dumped Harriet's body into Cayuga Lake. We don't know if that's true because her body was never found. He could have dumped her in a different lake. He could have buried her so deep it was never dug up. We know that the Ruloff family did try to drag Cayuga Lake, and no body was ever found. Harriet is said to haunt the shores of Cayuga Lake to this day. Even with the 10-mile distance between the family heartland in Dryden, where Ruloff was living, and where Ruloff was living in Lansing, the family remained close, and they quickly noticed that mother and child were not responding to attempts at contact anymore. They didn't come to visit, and nobody was ever home when the Shutes tried to come visit the Ruloffs. And so they asked Ruloff, who claimed that wife and daughter were traveling, which is really suspicious, right? I mean, Upper New York was a relatively safe place to be at this point in time, but still, it would have been very unusual for a mother 2 months out of childbed to go traveling with her infant daughter. He did do a little traveling himself. He went to, I think it was Ohio and back. At one point, Harriet's oldest brother, Ephraim, got a warrant and authorization to drag Ruloff back to New York, and he quite doggedly ran Ruloff down and hauled him back in chains to stand trial. And this was interesting and very much a stark contrast to last week's book, right? Where I said they went from arrest to trial to execution in assembly line fashion, like in as little as 3 days, with convictions taking as little as 8 minutes for deliberation. Very much not the case here in America in 1871. Or, no, wait, 45. This was 1845, excuse me. The judge in the Ruloff case allowed for 2 charges to be brought against Ruloff. Kidnapping and murder, okay? The simple fact was there was not enough evidence for a murder conviction. And the jury knew that. And, I mean, God bless honest men, man, because the jury, they all knew the Shute family. Ruloff was not well known or well liked in this area, but there wasn't enough evidence to support a murder conviction, so they convicted him of kidnapping. Because she was gone, nobody could find her, and he went to prison. He was in prison for 10 years. He finally got what he wanted, not the prison sentence. That was just incidental to what he did want, which was time to read and study, which, if I thought that was possible, I might consider a jail sentence myself, but realistically, it's not like you're actually in control of your time when you're in prison these days, right? I mean, back then, things were maybe a little bit more lenient. I don't want to say that. I don't know. I've never been in a 19th century prison that I recall. I mean, maybe in a past life, but this isn't exactly, breaking knowledge in my head here. But he had time to read and study, and he did a lot of it. He spent almost all of the 10 years working on his linguistic theory, which, as I said earlier, was very convoluted, would eventually be roundly rebuffed and debunked, not just in his day, but to today. The author of this book took his theory to a modern-day linguist, Dr. Michael Weiss at Cornell University, who in the short version said that there's just no there there. There's nothing here. It's just gibberish. But to Ruloff, it was his raison d'etre. Right? This is what he wanted. He wanted to study, he believed in his theory, and he spent 10 years working on perfecting it. After the 10 years, Ruloff was released, only to be immediately arrested again. They attempted to try him again for murder of Harriet. However, Ruloff didn't just study languages when he's in prison, he also studied the law. Quite handily pointed out that this was a violation of law, as he has already been tried once before for her murder and found not guilty on that charge. A second trial constituted double jeopardy, and the judge reluctantly agreed with him. It was like, yep, I got to kick this one out because he's right. This is the walking, talking definition of double jeopardy here. You have no new evidence to support that a murder has in fact taken place, and he was already found not guilty of murder. But, he was never tried for Priscilla. I mean, the judge basically handed that to the DA and said he was never tried for Priscilla, and the DA went, my God, you're right. How about your missing baby? And this is where he said, he sent his daughter to his brother, which could neither be proven nor disproven, because his brother actually did have a daughter named Priscilla. Ironic coincidence. I think it was while he was waiting on appeal, because he actually was found guilty of the murder of Priscilla, and he was waiting on the appeal because there was no body, and that was the crux of his appeal. There's no body, there's no crime, right? While he was waiting on that appeal, Ruloff befriended the assistant warden's spouse and son, Jane and Albert Jarvis, who both assisted him in escaping from prison, and he made a break for Pennsylvania, where he assumed a false identity, one James Nelson, from England, and began teaching at college there. I think it was Meadsville, she said. Now, around the time he received an offer of a full-time teaching position in North Carolina under his assumed name, Ruloff received a letter from from Jane Jarvis, that Al had been arrested for petty theft or burglary, something like that. And if Ruloff didn't come to assist him, she would tell everybody everything, including, I'm assuming, his assumed identity. Now, Ruloff still could have easily vanished to North Carolina. But for whatever reasons of his own, he declined to do so. He chose instead to return to New York and assist Jarvis. However, there was still an active warrant in his arrest for New York for the prison escape, if nothing else. So Ruloff, rather than going to North Carolina, was instead arrested in Ohio and returned to New York, where the Court of Appeals looked at Ruloff's own carefully prepared document regarding his conviction for the murder of his daughter, where he pointed out there was no body. If there's no body, there's no crime. And apparently this was the first time that legal argument had been made, and the Court of Appeals agreed with him. If there's no body, there's no crime. No thought of where the hell else would a 2-month-old have gone all on her own. They agreed with him. And his conviction for murder was thrown out. And the judge ordered a third trial, which never happened because no body was ever found. It was at this point that they exhumed Amelia and Emily, trying to nail down a cause of death, which, again, remained inconclusive, so he was let go. From there, he went to New York City in 1860, and he lived there quietly for the next decade. He acted as a nexus of a small band of thieves, one of which was Al Jarvis, who would commit burglaries at night and then fence the goods. In 1861, Ruloff was convicted again of theft and served 2 years in Sing Sing prison. This is where he met Billy Dexter, who was the third wheel of the tricycle of crime that he peddled through New York City for the following 8 years. Then in August of 1870, the trio decided to rob Halbert's dry goods store in Binghamton, New York, which was risky not so much for the burglary itself, but because Binghamton was less than 50 miles from Dryden, and the Shook clan was definitely known in Binghamton. Again, a large family spread out across upstate New York. And they had neither forgiven nor forgotten Ruloff for their lost daughters, for Amelia, Emily, Harriet, Priscilla. They were still pissed. So in August of 1870, Ruloff, Jarvis, and Dexter quietly entered into Halbert's dry goods, take off their shoes for better sneaking, and chloroform the clerks who had been on night shift. Now, back then, night shift just meant you slept in the store, not that you were awake and on duty for the store. So chloroforming them was not really risky, just a precaution, right? They're already asleep. Let's drug them and knock them out so that they don't wake up while we're doing the robbery. Well, that means absolutely nothing when the effects of the chloroform wear off at the same time that the burglars trip over something, creating enough of a racket that the clerks woke up. One of the clerks who woke up, Frederick Merrick, fought viciously. However, Merrick dropped his handgun, during which time Ruloff picked up the handgun and shot him in the head with it. The three thieves at this point bolted from the store, made for the river, which was supposed to be shallow enough to just walk across. It was not. Both Jarvis and Dexter ended up drowning during the escape attempt. This is well before the felony murder rule, so Ruloff was never charged with their deaths. Ruloff tried to hide out locally, but was eventually found by a local farmer. He did give a fake name on being found, tried to pretend like he was just a vagrant, but the entire community was on high alert at this point. The remaining clerk, Gilbert Burroughs, was alert enough to advise that there had been 3 burglars, so when only 2 bodies were found, all transients were rounded up. And it wasn't too long before Ruloff was correctly identified. I actually think in an ironic twist it was by the judge who oversaw his first trial for the kidnapping and murder of Harriet and was like, that man is Edward Ruloff. And with that identification, all bets are off. His name was known, he was hated, he was quickly arrested for the murder of Merrick. Now, you might argue, well, wait a minute, if he was known and hated, they just arrested him because they knew and hated him. Not quite. There was evidence. First off, Jarvis was a known associate. All right, everybody remember that Jarvis had helped him to escape. So it was a little bit too coincidental that Jarvis was right there. I mean, hell, Jarvis's assistance of Ruloff before had caused his own father's disgrace and dismissal as a prison warden. His father eventually relocated to California, and it didn't take too long to tie Dexter to Ruloff. And there was no question that Ruloff was the third man in the break-in. Also, there was the smoking gun. And I don't mean the gun that killed Merrick. That's the literal gun. I mean, during one of Ruloff's earlier escape attempts, I don't remember if it was before his trial for Harriet or after his conviction for Priscilla, but he experienced frostbite on his feet while trying to escape and lost one of his big toes. I don't remember if it was his left or right one. I don't know if she ever says. This necessitated the purchase of custom footwear to offset the loss of balance created by the loss of a big toe. Okay? So when the trio bolted from Halbert's dry goods, they left their shoes behind, the ones they took off so that they could sneak. And like Cinderella's glass slipper, the custom orthotics were a perfect fit for one Edward Ruloff missing a big toe. And he was found guilty of murder of the clerk and sentenced to hang in March of 1871. I don't remember the exact date because he didn't meet that deadline. Because the question was being bandied about at this point of, was his mind too remarkable to execute? between the time of his conviction and his final date with the hangman, there were a parade of visitors to Binghamton Prison who tried to answer that very question. I started with Ham Freeman, who owned or edited a newspaper. He would become Ruloff's official biographer and last remaining friend. I mean, he was with him literally up until the moment of his hanging. And Ham was absolutely convinced of Ruloff's brilliance. Following Ham would be another newspaperman, Oliver Dyer. He seems to have been equally bewitched and repelled by Ruloff. Greek scholar Richard Henry Mather, who taught at Amherst College, was intrigued by Ruloff's language theories, which he read about in Dyer's newspaper articles. Ruloff really wanted to impress Mather, right? He was a linguist. He was very much living the life that Ruloff wanted, a respected academic, recognized expert in the field of languages. Ruloff had attempted to present his linguistic theories to the Philological Convention for sale for the absolutely absurd amount of $500,000, which would be around $10 million in today's currency. The convention looked at his theory and declined to purchase it, not least of which was because the theory had no merit. But when challenged, even gently on his ideas, Ruloff became aggressively confrontational. It made the Philological Convention nervous. He was so aggressive. Now, Dr. Mather would conclude that while Ruloff's ideas lacked merit, he could not be guilty of murder in the traditional sense because he suffered from monomania. Now, this diagnosis no longer exists. But in the 19th century, it was a belief that, quote, a patient inflicted with monomania suffered from a form of partial insanity provoked by one pathological preoccupation, end quote. Now, Dr. Mather felt sympathy for Ruloff, partially buying into his, oh, woe is poor pitiful me, life has been really hard to me, telling of his life, but ultimately concluded that, quote, the author was a much better murderer than philologist. Here is a man of great philological pretensions, undeniably endowed with extraordinary abilities, possessed of varied acquirements, yet a being heartless, soulless, a perfect Mephistopheles, who has gone through a long and checkered career of black and unredeemed villainy. I do not believe the man has any tenderness save for language. In looking at him, you would never imagine him as loving any human being, and you would be sure that his hatred would be implacable, end quote. That apparently was not condemnation enough, because the next visitor was George C. Sawyer, who was the principal at Utica Free Academy, which, despite it being free, was one of the premier educational facilities of the day to which upper classes endeavored to send their sons for teaching. He also came in and interviewed Ruloff. He thought Mather had been suckered in by him. Their meeting was confrontational from the get-go, as Ruloff knew that Sawyer disliked him in that way that all animals of cunning have a sense for when somebody doesn't like them. And I'm using that phrasing very specifically. Ultimately, I think that Ruloff was a psychopath, which means he had a level of animal cunning, not unlike nature's most beloved psychopath, the cat. All right? Cats know when you like them, when you don't like them. I think he did too. He knew that Sawyer didn't like him. Their meeting was confrontational from the get-go. Sawyer was not sucked in at all. He saw Ruloff as neither a brilliant, tortured academic nor as a person deserving of pity. I think he saw Ruloff for who he was. He knew the man there was something broken in him, and he was dangerous. I think he looked at Ruloff and saw the psychopath. And that's a word that didn't exist in the 19th century. That didn't come about for 100 years after. I dare say that decades of teaching teenagers, most of whom are psychopaths until they grow out of it, taught Sawyer a thing or two about recognizing evil at face value. And I think he recognized that in Ruloff. An alienist did view him, which was what psychologists were called back in the day. They weren't called psychologists, they were called alienists. One Dr. John Gray from Utica Lunatic Asylum. Ruloff resented this. His lawyer got the Dr. Gray in. Basically, if he could be found insane, then we can't really execute him. Ruloff resented this. He was openly hostile to Gray, and Ruloff was not insane. All right, and if he was found insane, any future hope of recognition for his linguistic theories would be buried under the label of insanity. So he was hostile from Dr. Gray from the word go. Fortunately for Ruloff's legacy, Dr. Gray agreed. He's not insane. Dr. Gray, this is interesting, he based his belief on a physical examination, believing that if one was physically fit, then one must also be mentally fit. Don't worry, that theory has long been debunked. And he was right, all right. Psychopathy is a personality disorder, not a mental disorder. But he was right for the wrong reasons. Phrenologists also wanted to examine Ruloff's skull. Phrenology has also been debunked. That's the the belief that the bumps and lumps in your head can tell more about you than anything else, that has roundly been debunked, thank God. I don't know what a phrenologist would say about me. So I got a bump here, a bump over here. I have a spot up here that occasionally gets mushy when I get a headache, which I think that's just synovial fluid, but I don't know. Anyways, the final examination would take place after Ruloff's execution, which occurred on May 18th, 1871, and he died ugly. He was hung. Rather than a drop through a sprung trap door that they used a counterweight to jerk him up. The belief was that, the counterweight would jerk him up so fast that it would break his neck and it would be a quick execution. It's a good theory. In reality, what happened is the weight dislocated his neck but did not break it, so that Ruloff strangled slowly over the course of about 15 minutes. Ruloff was the, I don't know if it's because of this pronouncement, the doctor who examined him after his death. They checked the pulse, make sure he's dead, cut him down. They actually checked his pulse the first time and still felt a slow beat, so isn't that horrifying? And of course left him there to hang a little longer before they cut him down. But that doctor was like, yeah, they didn't break his neck, they dislocated it. He strangled to death. And I think it's because of that this was the last public execution in the state of New York. Not that New York never executed anybody again, but they became private closed affairs. And after he was dead, his family never claimed his body. He wanted his brother to claim it, but his brother never did. So his head was sold by Ruloff's attorney, George Becker, to Dr. Daniel Burr, a neurologist who wanted to study Ruloff's brain. Incidentally, his brain was inordinately large. It weighed in at 3.6 pounds. The author gave the measurement in grams, but I did the conversion for us Americans who still use pounds because fuck the metric system. The average brain weight is 3 pounds, so his was about a half pound heavier than most people's. He was an outlier, right? Also, his skull was inordinately thick and difficult to cut through, so was the neck muscles, because his doctor had to saw the head off to then, I don't know. I guess he could have just cut off the top of the head, but he didn't. He cut the head off and then cut the brain out of the head, and all of this was not an easy task because they didn't have electrical bone saws, so he had to actually saw it apart, and it was apparently really thick and difficult to cut through. It's actually not a bad cocktail. It's slightly bitter, but it's not bad. Most post-death, and I mean 40 years post-death, died in 1871, so 1909, so 38 years, we'll say. Ruloff's brain was used to show that there is literally no difference in brain shape between him and anyone else, which was a concept that absolutely rocked the scientific community when it was presented by Dr. Burt Wilder in 1909 at a conference. And he presented side-by-side pictures of brains from white, black, Asian, probably Native American, criminal, non-criminal, man, woman, showing they all had the same folds and grooves and were functionally the same. And at one point, Dr. Wilder had the largest collection of brains anywhere. It's like 1,600 brains of not just humans. He had about 403 or 430 human brains, but enough to be able to say, hey, look, we're all the same. We all have the same brains, all right? Nothing is really different other than life experiences. Fair. They all have the same folds and grooves. We're all functionally the same. It wasn't until the advent of MRIs where they could study the density in brain and gray matter, they're able to start seeing actual differences between a psychopath's brain and our brain, and our brains, the brains of normal humans who don't have psychopathy, right? The author does an absolutely masterful job intertwining the story between the interviews and conversations with the various experts who visited Ruloff in jail up until his execution. I could easily see this being made into a Netflix special as a series of interviews and flashbacks, right? Opens in a prison. You have Ham coming in, starting the interview with Edward Ruloff, and Ruloff goes into flashback mode, and we're seeing him as a kid and wanting to go to college, and his uncle saying no, and blah, blah, blah. So I could see that as a really good Netflix show. She includes throughout each chapter modern-day diagnostics to draw the conclusion that Ruloff may have been the first documented psychopath, drawing parallels between his behavior and that of Ted Bundy, Ed Kemper, Dennis Rader, and others. And she does point out that, hey, guess what? Even psychopaths can contribute to society, because you know what the #1 recorder of audiobooks is? Ed Kemper, who reads audiobooks for the blind. Isn't that weird? It's kind of creepy. I used to date a guy who was blind. There's a very good chance I have heard Edward Kemper's voice and not even known it at the time. Fucking weird. Slightly creepy, but good, he found a purpose, right? The only reason he wasn't called a psychopath, Ruloff, not Kemper, the only reason Ruloff wasn't called a psychopath back in the 19th century is that psychology had not evolved to the point of having a diagnostic yet for that. Basically, there was no word for what he was back in the 19th century. I think Dr. Mather probably got closest. I think monomaniac may have been the closest to an accurate 19th century diagnosis at the time. And the only stumble the author had, and it was so disappointing, I really was bummed by this one, because I thought I had found like the one author who had enough integrity to keep her political bullshit out of her writing. The book is only 284 pages. On page 277, she talks about racism in the Trump era.
Oh, no. You were doing fine.
I'm actually starting to suspect that there are contractual obligations to, in publishing, to include your political opinion, no matter how ham-fisted the introduction of said opinion may be. I mean, she could have easily said, even today, racists will advocate for eugenics, but she didn't, right? She just, all...
And now this ham-handed segue into your questionnaire. It won't do.
Trump supporters must be racist, and so, hey, that's today's era. She also didn't mention that the biggest eugenicist of all and contemporary to Dr. Wilder was Margaret Sanger. She did say, quote, "We can trace the history of scientific racism from Wilder's death in 1925 to more recent trends like racist theories offered in the bell curve and other current scientific research that contends that racial differences are genetic and not a social construct." Okay, well, the bell curve was published in 1994, so that's not exactly cutting-edge science. And social construct? I mean, tell me you're a postmodernist without using the word postmodernist. Bullshit. I kind of think that George Sawyer's confrontation with Ruloff was exactly that. Ruloff was spouting 19th century linguistic version of postmodernist theory, and Sawyer was having none of it. He's like, that makes absolutely no sense, and you're a fucking idiot, and I'm done with you. Good on him. She does mention genome mapping, which in 2003 shows that 99.9% of all genes are in common across humanity, which for some reason she treats that like it's a surprise. It's not. We are all, after all, human, right? No one is biologically superior, which is absolutely true. We're all human. No one is biologically superior to anybody else. But racial differences are not a social construct. They're an evolutionary result, all right? There are biological reasons for people who evolved near the equator to have developed a greater capacity for melanin production to help protect them against the sun's rays. There are reasons why people further away from the equator develop lighter skin. It's to help with vitamin D production, all right? There are health reasons for this on both counts. That is not to say that one is superior to the other. They're not. We're all the same. We're all human. I am going to point out that as of 2022, which this book was published in 2022, which means she probably finished it in late 2020 or sometime in 2021, because it has to go through editors and fact checking and the publication and everything else. So after she finished writing it, the Human Genome Project managed to identify 65 different genomes. The good news is all the genomes still confirm we're all human. So no one is superior to anybody else. That holds true. Nobody is superior. Difference does not mean better or worse. It's just different. But to say there are no evolutionary reasons for differences in appearance it is bullshit. And it's not a social construct. Claiming they are a social construct is patently anti-scientific. But overall, despite that stumble at the finish line, I quite like this book. All right, and her stumble at the finish line wasn't overarching leitmotif like it was in Whack Job a few weeks ago. It was one stumble. It was a stumble into politics at what should have been a purely apolitical book. But overall, she's an outstanding storyteller. I mean, Kate Winkler Dawson wove a fascinating narrative of a disturbed psychopathology 100 years before such a thing even existed. Or was known to exist, I should say. Clearly it existed, but it wasn't known to exist. They didn't have the words for it. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye.